Well, thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Carly Smith. I'm with the Foundation for California Community Colleges. I help lead our California Community Colleges Health and Wellness Program, which is putting on a series of trainings over the next few weeks focused on mental health, specifically for communities of color and other groups who have been historically marginalized. And so we're very, very excited today to have Dr. Wayne Cow, who will be leading a training on how to support our AAPI communities, which we know is especially important right now as we've seen this recent rise of violence towards AAPI communities. And so I'm very, very thankful that Dr. Cow has taken the time to offer this training for all of us today. If you are interested in learning about the upcoming trainings or getting access to the recording of the training that we had last week and the training today, you can email myself or wellness@foundationccc.org, and I will send you those recordings and the dates for the upcoming trainings, and I'll put both emails in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cow, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carly. I'm very honored to be here. So thank you everybody for registering and joining today. I just want to take a little time and introduce myself. So yes, I'm Dr. Wayne Cow. I am a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing, I would say, for 13 years now, but I decided to be a psychologist at the age of 15. And I've actually been through a few different systems. I graduated from UC Santa Cruz with my bachelor's degree, but I also attended Miracosta College in North County where I grew up. And then I also taught at Pasadena City College for 6 to 7 years, and so teaching Asian American psychology. Right now, I own my own clinic, Healing Rhythm Psychological Services, and I also am the president of the San Gabriel Valley Psychological Association. So I have my hands in a few different pots, and so I'm really glad that I can be here and kind of share what I know, and hopefully it'll be beneficial to everyone involved. Before I kind of get into the presentation itself, I wanted to check in with everyone and see, how's everybody feeling right now with the ongoing increase in anti-Asian hate crimes, bias, incidents that have been occurring. I know this last year and a half have been particularly difficult with the pandemic. But if anybody wants to share in the chat of just how's everybody been coping and feeling about the attacks that have happened. I know I think yesterday I heard in downtown LA somebody was driving through downtown randomly shooting, looking for Asians to shoot. I think that I haven't read anything on it, but I was told about it, and so yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling already a little bit. So, but how's everybody coping right now? I see exhausting. Yes, it is very exhausting. Disturbed. Yes. Yes. Being more vigilant for not just for ourselves, but parents, elderly. Outright just trying to avoid it, and in some ways even pretend it's not even happening. But at the same time, yes, it is giving us an opportunity to speak up and do something about it. Okay. So one of the things that when I presented on this actually just a little over a couple of months ago, and one of the things that came to me is the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think we're definitely in a place that we have to be more vigilant and more heightened in terms of if you're of Asian descent, or if you're a person of color for that matter, or in any kind of minority, that you have to be a little bit more vigilant. But a lot of this isn't exactly new. And so what we're dealing with now has been what we've been dealing with, at least as in my own experience, ever since I was a child. And today I will share some personal experiences of what I went through growing up, but also what I'm going through, what I go through now. And while again, I think that we're in a moment where we are having to be more heightened, a lot of it is still the same. So as I share this, I wanted to start with a thought exercise, and I think most of us have heard this, is that if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? And you can think about it, you can share in the chat box if you'd like. So the next question I have to this is that, so if it does make a sound, then, and nobody hears it, then how do we know that it made a sound? How do we respond to the sound? We can see the effects of it. Marie says, no, it doesn't make a sound. The other trees knowing. So oftentimes the reason why I'm bringing this up is there's something I've heard throughout my career, is that if something happens to you and you don't report it or you don't document it, then it didn't happen. But we know that it did. And so we're living in this place right now where if something isn't videotaped, if something isn't given physical proof, then it didn't happen. And I think right now what's happening in our API community, and what we found in a lot of different communities, is that a lot of incidents go unspoken of, unreported. And so even though maybe a select few people know what's happening, not everybody hears it. Like the people that can really do something about it don't get that information. And then sometimes if they do get the information, because it either can't be proven, or simply the person who can do something about it doesn't believe you, then essentially it didn't happen. Yes, and there's a degree of racial gaslighting. And so what we're doing now is that enough people are seeing it that we are speaking of it. We have everybody in this room today. We have the news media is covering a lot more of it. We are trying to address what we can and should address. And so, of course, if a tree falls in the forest, then yes, there is a sound, but are we hearing it? And so moving forward is what is actually unique right now about the current surge in anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian bias? One thing I think is really blaringly evident right now is that our elders are being attacked. Yes, we're seeing it through New York, Oakland, that specifically our elders are being attacked. So far, I haven't yet heard of any reason behind it. And yet that's what's happening. Probably degree of defenselessness, but one thing I think of is if it's our Asian elders that are being attacked, then why is it specifically our community of elders? It's a very interesting process that I hope at some point we can get some answers to. And yes, the PowerPoint will be made available. I'll email it to Carly. And so this is something that you don't necessarily have to respond in the chat room if you don't feel comfortable. But I want to ask is, when we hear about things like this, when we get this information in, whether it's the news, whether we hear it from our friends, whether we hear it from, word of mouth, is, do we believe it? Do we sometimes think that it's not as serious as it's being made out to be? It was made, we saw that very clearly in this last year or so with COVID-19, is that as deaths were being reported, as cases were being reported, a lot of people within our country were saying that it's not as serious as it's being reported. Some people are outright saying that the amount of deaths are actually fake, that they're not as high as what's being reported. And so this goes back into, our thought exercise with the tree, is that if it's being told to us, but we don't see it for ourselves, do we think that we are able to decide whether or not we think it actually happened? And because we are all in the college system, we can see it through our students. And so with our students, and as we move forward to think, what does it mean to be an ally? If you are not, in this case, not in the Asian community, you're not Asian, or you are not a person of color, but you want to do something, you want to be of help, you want to support. What does it mean to be an ally? Speak out. Yeah. And how do we speak out? Listen. Show up, stand up. Amplify BIPOC voices. So here are some address unconscious and conscious bias. Yes. So here's one of the things that I see oftentimes in conversations I have, is that do we struggle also with diversity sometimes? Do we have questions like affirmative action comes up a lot in conversations I have, of the belief that if you are a person of color or are a minority, that it's possible that you earned your space in a system because of your race, because of the color of your skin or your minority status. And to anybody who does struggle with that, I just want to ask, and maybe give a little bit more of give a little bit more insight into it, is if you do become frustrated with that, or you do feel, diversity is maybe a little overblown and whatnot, are you angry with the individual or the system? Are we, when we get mad or when we get frustrated that somebody, quote unquote, did not earn their place, are we mad at the person or are we mad at the system? And so this brings into light, and again, these are thoughts, just things to have in the back of your mind as we are moving forward today, is this gets into the conversation of qualifications versus diversity. That if we try to diversify our system, diversify our campus, is it implying that people are not always qualified for it? And is that a part of the system or a part of the individual? Oftentimes what I see is that we put the blame or we put the burden on the individual, and we get angry with them. And so hopefully today, as we're talking, is that I can give a little bit more guidance and a little bit more information as to what we can do. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit and just give people a little bit of a context and history of Asian American struggles in the US, specifically in this country. And so some of these events I just wanted to highlight is that we started back in 1882 to 1943, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. And some of it, you'll be able to see how it trickles down to even to this day, is that there was a prohibition of Chinese laborers from entering the US. The Chinese were viewed as a reason for economic hardship. After the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, large numbers of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Filipino Americans were allowed into the US for cheap labor. However, women were excluded, and they were seen as threats to efficiency and exploitability of the workforce. Women were allowed to immigrate then in the early 1900s, but most of the immigrated women were prostitutes brought in by the US to fulfill the sexual needs of Asian men to prevent desire for marriage. Back in Asia, however, married Asian women with immigrant husbands became more assertive and self-sufficient. And so Asian men sent money to family members instead of their wives to kind of curb independence. And so that became a separate issue. Now, part of kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same, is one thing I wanted to highlight is that if immigrated women were seen as prostitutes, I want to actually highlight the Atlanta shootings, in that part of the reason that we can speculate is that in the massage clinics, the massage spaces, is that were these women seen as the same thing? This was over 100 years ago. But in some cases, we are still struggling with the same thing. 1942 to 1945, there was the Japanese internment. This had to do with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. People of Japanese descent were forced to enter isolated camps. If you live in the LA area and go to the Santa Anita Mall in Arcadia, that was a camp. The US government recruited intern Japanese for service in the American military, but still had family in camps. And their acknowledgement of service didn't come until the 1980s, where there was a formal apology and reparations that were made not until 1988. But back in internment, families were forced to sell or dispose of their homes, businesses, and farms without due process, despite being born in the US for many Japanese Americans. And despite that, they were seen as eternally loyal to Japanese government and therefore spies. No incidents of espionage were ever reported. But there was still the fear. Shooting ahead to 1982, of the American recession in 1982, this was an incident that was, I don't think gets enough attention today, but a group of auto workers in Detroit took sledgehammers to Toyotas and Japanese branded import vehicles. And on June 19, two white auto workers killed a man named Vincent Shin, a California engineer, before his wedding due to looking Japanese. Vincent Shin was a Chinese American. And so finally, just some terms to consider is that being in the Asian American community, there is a term of, oh, sorry, let me check. Okay. So there is a term, if you haven't heard of it before, is called the model minority, and that it is the belief that Asian Americans have achieved economic success in the US and therefore face no overt barriers to, and are the exception to racism. And then specifically, and I think this is even more so highlighted now, is that Asian Americans are seen as not complaining of any obstacles. There's also the perpetual foreigner, and that no matter the success or perceived assimilation into American culture, Asians are generally considered to be inherently foreign. It doesn't matter if you were born here, doesn't matter if you've been here for generations within your family. Because of the color of your skin, you are always a foreigner, never truly American. And so moving forward to where we are now, these are some of the things that I want to make sure that everybody is aware, is that when we talk, there is so much diversity even within our community of Asian Americans, and that the continent of Asia can span from China, Japan, Korea to India, even Pakistan, and Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines. And so while the cultures are all considered Asian, we can oftentimes be very, very different. On top of that, we also have to consider the generations. And so in terms of immigration, how many generations have you been in the US? Are you the first to immigrate here? And then if you are first generation immigrant, did you come early or did you come while you were an adult? And so when we think, I'll just highlight the first three, is that if you're first generation, it's generally considered you're first to immigrate in your family. If you're second generation, your parents immigrated here, but you were either born and raised here or came very early. I am personally second generation. I was born and raised here, but my parents immigrated here. Or you're third generation and deeper in that you're not only were your parents born and raised here, but so were their parents, and sometimes even their parents, and down the line. And so I invite you to think of your level of, in terms of your generation, what your level of acculturation or assimilation is. And so when I talk about acculturation, I'm talking about people who are able to, in a way, navigate between the two cultures or the three cultures that they're in. So for me, I'm Taiwanese American, so I consider myself very acculturated between the two, where I identify as both Taiwanese and American. I try not to denigrate or dismiss either side. But if you are assimilated, it is being able to fully integrate into, in this case, American culture, sometimes to the dismissal of your heritage or your parents' cultural background. And so if you see your students and they are of Asian descent, what have you noticed in terms of struggles that they're going through? How often do you see international students? And if they're not international students and they're Asian American, what kind of struggles do you notice within our Asian students? So here is the, feel free to chime in the chat as we go along. But here's one thing I noticed. So when I was teaching at PCC, I was teaching the Asian American psychology class, and what I saw was that out of the 40 to 45 students, I would say every semester, for the exception of one or two students, every student was Asian. And I think it quickly became the class that students believed if they're Asian, by virtue of them being Asian, they would get an A. Now, obviously, that was not the case. But they thought that, well, wow, I'm Asian and this is an Asian American psychology class, I'll understand it quite well. But being also that this was Pasadena, this was Los Angeles, George, I see your comment about language barriers, especially for international students. This is what I noticed. About half of my students were international. And of those half of the students, most of them did not speak English. And so they were sitting in my class, in which I would imagine they're sitting in your class if they're international, not understanding what you're saying. The other thing that I was noticing is that of the other half of the students who are either raised in America, born in America, and of Asian descent, is that the class was very triggering for them, and that they were bringing up a lot of barriers, a lot of obstacles that as Asian Americans that we specifically go through. Being seen as that we don't belong here, having to navigate our family obligations with school life, sometimes our parents not understanding what it means to be, have higher education and what it requires. And so a lot of those different generational barriers that come up that are quite unique sometimes to our culture, and also very similar at the same time to a lot of different cultures. But we do have our unique struggles. And so these are one of the things that as I highlight it, I hope you guys can all see that you can all gain some insight into it. Yes, a lot of anxiety. Asian struggles with anxiety because of their parents, like high expectations to excel, very much so. And this is one of the things about community college is that while I think we know differently, I think there is an expectation for Asian students to move straight into a four-year university. And so being at a community college can sometimes feel like a step down and that they've already failed. Now, we know that that's not true, but it shows the level of expectation and the level of anxiety that gets placed if you're not meeting that expectation. And so these are some of the things that I've seen, and this is what's coming. Like what I've seen is that for international students and actually for a lot of American-born students, I was told of a lot of sometimes bias by other faculty, that my students are cheating, and lacking support in trying to navigate through the system. And so I think also specifically for our international students, it's important that we keep in mind that a lot of them are here in the US without their family. And so if not only if they don't speak much English, that they are also here by themselves without their parents, without their siblings, if they have siblings. And so all they have is maybe a smattering of a group of friends that they might have, and that's all they have. A lot of the family obstacles that that was mentioned is especially now with COVID-19, there's a lack of space at home. And if there are financial burdens, that they're not able to gain access to the resources and the materials that they need. And then I think this is more specific to American-born or raised Asian Americans, but I think this is definitely true for most, but I think it adds a different layer, is navigating between two cultures. This is something that I grew up with, is I grew up in Encinitas, Carlsbad, and as a child, it was still predominantly Caucasian. And so for me, I would go to school speaking English, and I would come home speaking Mandarin. It was very clear to me as a child that I had to behave one way when I was at school because my friends, my classmates, my teachers all spoke a different language than my parents. But they also had different expectations. At school, I was expected to ask questions. I was expected to be a little bit more gregarious, be a little bit more outgoing. And then when I went home, I was expected to be obedient, do my homework, say very little, and just follow the rules. And so once we become adults, it's hard to figure out sometimes what the rules are. And so one thing I saw a lot, and I think this will give us a lot of room to think, is with the issue of cheating, is that I saw a lot of I could tell that a lot of my students were hiring other students to write their papers. And I obviously became very frustrated by them not doing their own work. And what I started telling them is that I knew that they were cheating, and I was telling them, and they didn't believe me. And so what they saw was that I would fail them on their midterm, and they would come to me and I would explain to them, I know they're cheating. And for the very reason that they do not speak English, and somehow they were able to write a grammatically perfect paper. And then when I asked them to tell me what they wrote, they couldn't tell me. Now, I kind of split these students into two camps. One was the obvious one, and I think is the students who just don't want to do their work. They don't want to be in college. They don't really care, and so they're just there. The other students that I was seeing were afraid to acknowledge that they were not able to really speak English. And so if they were afraid to acknowledge it, they were afraid to ask for help. Now, when I talked to a lot of my colleagues about this, they said, well, there's the ESL class, there are the writing centers, there are all of these different resources that can help them. And that's all true. But I think in speaking with Rie Park's comment of acculturative stress and identity issues is that still requires students to admit that they are struggling. And one of the biggest difficulties I had is that in order for them to admit they needed help, I needed to fail them. They needed to see that F. And it was shown even more so is that I would actually start my classes speaking Mandarin to most of my international students. And I could see the relief on their faces in knowing that there was a faculty member that spoke their language. And I told them that they needed to talk to me if they were struggling and that I could help them. I could read their papers. I could give them assistance. And yet they still wouldn't bring anything up. They still would not let me know that they needed help until they saw the F on their paper. Now, after talking to these students, once they did get the F, we were able to reach out a little. I was able to reach out a little bit to help them understand, to talk to them. And then finally they would open up about their struggles, their inability to really speak the language, their nervousness about failing and admitting that they needed help. But in their process, I forced them to continue to write their paper, and I gave them a little space to edit their paper, to practice. And by the end of the semester, they came to me saying that even their ESL professor was saying that their English and writing had actually improved immensely just in that semester. And it was simply just getting them to do their own work. But as I'm talking, as I'm sharing this experience, I hope that you can see that it's not as simple as just making them do the work, is that there's a degree of having to get to know them, to talk to them about what their struggles are. And this is something that I think we can all collaborate on, because when it comes to the bias by faculty, what I think is specific to this group of students is that what they've shared with me, what they come to me is oftentimes that there's faculty that get upset with them for not speaking enough English, that they feel like the faculty members are frustrated or don't like that they ask questions. And so they get afraid to ask any professor. And so when I ask them, even though I speak Mandarin, and even though I'm telling you to ask me, what they then tell me when I ask them why do they still not ask me is that they don't believe that I won't yell at them. They actually think that sometimes, like as the professor, that I must be lying to them, that it's a test. And so I wanted to throw this out to you to see what your perspectives are with your students. Like, do you get frustrated? I know this is not an easy profession. It can oftentimes be very thankless. But how have you found yourself working with, in this case, international students? In your experience, thank you, Christine, for sharing that our students aren't connecting with our tutors or the library. And actually, Christine, if you could share more, is you're saying that you didn't use them when you were a student. Can you share a little bit more as we move along of what keeps us from using these resources? Shame. I've allowed students to come into office just to practice speaking English. So Christine, you didn't believe that the tutors could help in the area. What can I ask further then? What stopped you from just looking though? I think this is the point. Is what stopped you from even looking, just to confirm. Yes, please. I think this is one of the big pieces, is that we're so afraid to look for help because what it means to say, like what it means when we do ask. And so we remain quiet. They feel bad for bothering people. And this I invite everybody to think is it hard for us to reach out for help in general? I know it is for me. As an international student, we feel bad when we're not well understood. Yes. Signs of weakness. Would you say it's, I would say so, yes. Family structures, it's, one of the conversations I had with many of my international students is, I tell them that they know my class is very much a discussion focused class. And so the expectation in class and part of their grade is to speak up and to give their opinion and to ask questions. And finally, a couple students had noted to me is that, Dr. Cow, you have to understand that back in our country of origin, our teachers tell us not to ask questions. That our parents tell us not to ask questions, to just sit in class, follow the lecture, take notes, and take the exam. And so when they come to the US and the expectations are the opposite, and especially because they don't speak the language that they really should be asking for help, is that they're still taking that lesson to not ask. Because it would mean that they're doing something wrong. They're going to get in trouble for it. And so now that it's compounded with COVID-19, with the pandemic, with classes all being online, we have more students that are being lost in the shuffle. And so when we talk about students navigating through different cultures and navigating between these two cultures, this is where they get stuck. And so let me go through some of these questions, because a lot has come through. So sometimes the tutors aren't very good, and that becomes a difficult struggle. Let's see. And so mental health is now being brought up too, is as students who struggle with mental illness, how do you recognize mental illness when you see it in class? It's hard to tell until they share it. Yes, yes. One of the most obvious experiences I have, and it shows more now so with online classes, how often do you have students who just don't turn in their assignments? That half the semester goes by, they don't turn what they need to turn in. They may show up to class, they may not show up to class, but they're not turning anything in. Some disappear, yes. They disappear. And so as I'm hearing from the participants and the attendees today, is some of these things are not things that can be documented, that these are sometimes experiences of the students, and they can compound. And I can share, as we've had the pandemic, I can share just in these experiences is that if we reflect on ourselves right now as faculty, one of the expectations that is of myself as a psychologist, as a professor, is that even as an Asian American, that I'm, because of my status, because of my education, that I have somehow transcended race. I've transcended these issues. And yet I worry about my own safety. When I go to my office, I worry about if there's somebody in the building that I don't know of, and especially with these now new kind of increased cases of violence, that this comes up, that I have these fears. I still have, on occasion, and actually now more frequently now, people coming up to me assuming that I don't speak English. People telling me to go back to where I came from. And then I have to go teach a class. And if I reflect on that, and I reflect on my students, if they are American born, American raised, can there be an assumption that they would not have these difficulties? Because not only can they speak English, but they can speak a second language. That they should be even more, they should have more of an advantage at school. But I think as I've struggled with it, and I think a lot of our students struggle with, with belonging. Janet, you had a statement as you didn't see how many Asian American students were asking for assistance until there was a BN form online. Can you share a little bit more about how how much of a spike it was or how much of a difference you saw? Have I experienced any bias from students because as an Asian American instructor? Yes, yes. Although maybe not in the way that that we would assume. I had a lot of Asian students think that I would simply give them an A because we're Asian. Kind of like Asian people unite. um, and so I think they were still a little shocked when I expected them to still do the work. But I think there was a bias in that students also thought that I was a little too helpful to other Asian students who needed help. But sometimes it's hard to see when I'm still expecting them to do the work, but I'm willing to let them rewrite and willing to let them practice. Well, Janet, you said you saw a 20% increase. That's pretty high. So I have a few pages of resources, and so I'll send this out to Carly, and then you can look at this on your time. But this would help is what I really wanted to focus on today is talking about how we engage our students. And if we are talking about this community right now, especially with the amount of bias and amount of the surge in violence right now, is how many of us, and then especially with our classes being online, is how many of us feel like we're able to really engage with our students right now? Whether when we get back in person or if we stay online, how many of us feel like that we are engaging, that we are checking in with our students? Yeah, we can't mandate that they attend, so sometimes we just don't do it. Mm. So Allison, you felt more able than before to be accessible. Allison, can I ask what has your office done to be more accessible in this time?
Sorry, just to quickly interject, if people want to speak, I can unmute you. So just raise your hand and I can offer to unmute you so you can share out. Sorry.
Okay. So at this point, oh yes, okay, sorry. Set up a Canvas shell with resources. Okay. So I think this really shows our difficulty with when we know that students are struggling, and yet we feel limited in being able to check in, and meanwhile they're having these struggles. I think one of the things that I have to admit is that that's very exhausting for me is I have to overextend myself. And so when students aren't doing well, I ask them to stay. I have to talk to them. I have to have them check in with me, and then they start talking. But that requires a lot more time on my part. And it can be exhausting.
Doc has to speak.
Doc, go ahead.
So I would say first of all, as a non-Asian activist, indigenous Chicano, I have noticed with my Asian male students, one and not all. I mean, there's nuances like everybody says, like Korean and Japanese and Chinese and Vietnamese. I mean, real differences in terms of the dynamic, even with them just seeing me and me seeing them first day of class, or online, just interactions. So I've had, and I didn't even know the basics of the stuff that you shared today. So just as on a human level and in the class structure level, I have had to like really almost become somebody I don't know in terms of me, in terms of trying to figure out how to just have a human connection. So everything you described was like, I felt an experience like huge walls between that weren't really personal. They were just real, like going to another country. And when I've gone to other countries and it was just real that I wasn't a part of what they were doing and they weren't a part of what I was doing. And if I was going to become a part of that, I needed to figure something out. So that's how it's been with my Asian male students. And so I've done tried a whole bunch of different things, but without getting into it all, the bottom line for me was to get to a place where an Asian student would bring another friend. They never came alone, but would come with another friend and say, hey, you did this, and I thought it was important for this friend to know this. And then from there, and that took a long time usually, and some of my students, Asian students, even failed my classes, or I failed them, I should say. And then they would come and take the class again and bring somebody and tell me why. And so even after they were approving, and my one of my levels of assessment was even after they were validating what I was attempting to do, it wasn't enough to create a teaching learning relationship but it was enough for them to come back and say, okay, that worked. And now I'm going to bring a friend and we're both going to take your class. I'm taking it again, and my friend's going to take it with me. That type of thing.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes I think we need that kind of support. And Doc, I'm glad you brought that up. And then also this is being brought up by G, I believe. And so in terms of instilling that trust and cultivating that space, I'm glad that both of you are bringing this up, because I think this is across the board in that there are a lot of assumptions in terms of people just simply not trusting. I think throughout this presentation, a lot of people have shared their experience of Students just simply not believing that they can help. That students not believing that their questions are going to be answered, and that if they don't believe that their questions aren't going to be answered, then they're just not going to ask, and they're just going to try to figure it out. And so one of the things that I've done a lot is really actively challenging them, especially when they're not doing well in the class, is that when I have students who tell me that, well, they weren't really sure if I was going to answer the question, they weren't really sure if I was going to be able to help them, I have to point out to them is that, but you don't know that. And this is something that I call kind of prescribing the paradox, is that, well, we were afraid that you were going to get upset with us. And so then I have to tell them, well, I'm upset with you now because you're failing my class. And so had you asked, maybe I would have been upset with you, but I'm already upset with you now. So there was a higher chance if you were to ask, then I wouldn't be upset with you, because then we would have been able to figure it out. But you didn't ask, and you thought that you would, that you could kind of somehow skirt by, and then you got found out. Doc, did you have another question or a comment?
Yes. So one of the challenges I had was in exploring how to relate. I got the feeling that if I'm going to call that type of challenge for me to be sort of aggressive, sort of assertive, sort of almost threatening and punishing type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But very, very politely, that's still inside me. What I noticed with these students was almost an immediate change of facial energy. Like, oh, I recognize this treatment, and almost an inner strength that said, and I'm not afraid of it, and it's not going to bother me, and I'm not going to communicate with you. You talk to me this way. Or even now that you did this, I'm not communicating. Now I totally understand who you are. And so I'm wanting to ask you if the strategy you just outlined and the psychology behind it
Mm-hmm.
is something that you think works particularly well with Asians in general, where or is there new Asian between Asians,
Mm-hmm.
or is there a difference? Keep in mind.
Yeah. I'll speak to my own community right now, and this is one thing that I want to make sure I clarify, and that when I use this, if you call it strategy, my hope is that it comes off very supportive, because I hope my desire comes through, and that I want to help. And me being upset is not necessarily being upset with them, but being upset that this is the situation we're in right now. That they failed the midterm, they could have asked for help. They didn't ask for help, and this is where they're at. And then sometimes the way they're asking for help is by cheating, and by asking somebody else to just write their paper, which is absolutely not okay. But oftentimes when I talk to them, a lot of what comes out is their fear of having come off incompetent. So maybe they take the convenient way out or the simple way out, but I can tell. And what I've found out over the years of teaching is that in my community, specifically my Asian students are desperate for connection. They want their professors to know that they need help, or they are looking for help, they are looking for support, but they are very very afraid of it. And so I think some attendees have shared their experiences of being students and knowing that they needed help, but being afraid to ask. And I think that's a lot of my Asian students, is that obviously if you don't speak the language, or obviously if you're struggling to understand the material, even though you speak perfect English, and sometimes that makes it even harder, is that a student is born and raised in the US and is having a hard time following the material. And why would somebody have that difficulty if they're speaking English and they can't, like, they're reading the material and they can't follow it? And so that's a very hard step to take, to ask a professor that they're not understanding. And so, Doc, I'm glad that you brought that up, because my experience with my students has been they desperately want help. They desperately want to talk. And I think this is the part of where I bring in my own work with clients and in my practice of being a psychotherapist, is there's still a process of that. And again, this goes into the maybe overextending yourself as a professor, is that a lot of my early work with any client is walking through with them, because even though they show up and they're wanting to talk, the first few sessions is they don't like talking. They're still afraid that they're going to get in trouble, especially my Asian clients, that they ask me a lot of time, am I doing this right? Am I doing this therapy right? And if I translate it to students that I teach, they're asking me the same thing. Am I being a good student? Is being a good student asking for help? Is being a good student admitting that they have no idea what is happening in class? Whether it's because they don't speak the language or that they do speak the language, and now they feel doubly stupid because they do not, like, even though they understand what's being said, they don't understand what's actually being communicated. If that makes sense to you. Doc, go ahead.
To me, that is like so vitally important. I'm wondering if you could elaborate just a little bit more then on if they speak English and they do all the things you mentioned, but they still feel like they don't understand. And even if you tell them, yeah, hey, you're being a good student, etc., but they still feel like they don't understand, what's that about? And any insight on that?
Oh, yes. I'm thank you for that. And I think we can all, unless it's not too traumatizing, to go back to college and remember, like, when you're reading a textbook and you're not understanding it, whether it's math, whether it's literature, whether it's you're reading Shakespeare and you can't understand it. And so again, it's very possible, and I think it's been proven, that you can speak the same language and not speak the same language all at the same time. Yes, Maria, I'm glad you can reflect on that. Is yes, reading the same page over 3 times, and you know the words, you're reading the words, you understand what the words mean, but you can't put it together. Like, somehow not being able to kind of string it together to understand the concept. And yes, before Gabrielle, you speak, I wanted to also point out, yeah, Maria, what you were saying is a lot of times students will go back to their parents and tell them, like, I'm not understanding. And if they are brave enough to tell their parents they're not understanding, their parents will also support that by saying, well, then you should, like, why aren't you understanding? Why don't you understand? And so if they're not getting that support at home, they're going to be afraid to tell their professor, because that sense of shame. Gabrielle, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I wrote something in the chat and I think I couldn't copy it into Q&A. But you were saying a lot about, you know, the cultural aspects of not asking for help and being vulnerable and just don't ask questions. And, you know, the CSU system is all about that and individualism and expression and finding community based more on interest. So I'll just kind of read what I said. They may not know or trust how rewarded those actions are in the college setting here. So how would you instill the trust and cultivate a more open space for them? Like, how do you have any tools for that or suggestions?
You know, the tools that I have is, again, kind of going back to that overextension, is I would have them come to me during break. Like I would specifically point the students that I know are struggling, like if I can tell, I would actually initiate office hours with them and have them talk to me, and just let them know I know they're struggling. And sometimes that's the first step. And part of instilling that trust is initiating part of that. And Gabrielle, tell me if this kind of tracks for you, is that kind of what I said earlier is when I tell them, if you tell me that you're afraid to ask because I'm going to get upset with you, how do you think I feel? Or how do you think I'm experiencing you failing a midterm?
Right. Yeah.
That's where you are. You didn't ask for help. And so this is where you are. If I can map it out, if we followed a second, like another scenario, is that if you came and told me, which and this is what I tell them at the beginning of the semester, if you want to write 2 pages of your midterm and then just send that to me before it's due, and I can tell you whether or not you're at least on the right track, or I can at least proofread the grammar because I know you need that help. Why wouldn't you do that?
Right. I think that like trust and fear of I'm going to get punished or I'm going to be, you know, feeling shame for not knowing, you know, we've all felt that at some point in college. But I guess just trying to instill that like these things are positive, like the learning environment. It's positive when you recognize that you don't understand something and you ask for help to try and understand it. Like
right. Yeah, and then that's part of the initiating, is that unfortunately, and I hate that this is the way that I have to do it, is when they do fail the midterm the first time, is right now you have an F. I am requiring you, if you want to get a better grade, then rewrite it. I'll reread it, and you may not get an A, but you won't have an F. And so when they rewrite it and I look at it, I will point out where their grammar is improving, or if they're not even international and they're just now kind of getting it and we work through it, is I point out to them, see, this is what happens when you ask for help. I'm pointing out what you need to work on. I'm helping you correct your grammar. And now you're improving. And then I ask a very simple question, is how does this feel right now? And most of my students will say, I'm still a little nervous, but this actually feels better because I get it, I'm learning.
Nice, I really like that.
And it's like, thank you. And then I tell them, like, I need you to remember this feeling. And then, you know, and I know not every faculty is going to be, you know, to have that time or to extend that time. But then I also tell them it's important to know your faculty. It's important to know who you can go to. So that way, if they do need help, they can go to a different professor.
Right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. And part of that is, and as I'm talking, I'm hoping all of this makes sense to everybody in attendance, is this is a part of the engagement in trying to have to point out these different pieces to them to help them learn. one of the last things I'll say, and then I'll leave room for more Q&A, is we've talked a lot about shame today. We've talked a lot about feeling like we can't make mistakes, and in our Asian community that we have to kind of bear it and try to just pretend that we know what we're doing, or just kind of not ask for help because of this fear of failure. We're told that we can't be afraid. And I'll share this. This is a personal experience I learned early on from my dad. Is I remember I was 9 years old and I got a 96% on an exam. And I came home, I was really excited. I even had the test in my hand that said 96, and it was an A. And I made the mistake of telling my dad. And I told my dad, hey, look what I did. And without smiling, my dad looked at me and said, what went wrong? Yes, Maria, it sounds like you've had this experience too. Is that he said, what went wrong? And he didn't ask it as nicely as I'm saying it now. He actually looked upset. And I said, what do you mean I got an A? And he said, well, but it's not 100. That means you missed 4 points, meaning why were you? And he was a little mean about it. And he was like, why did you, why didn't you get those right? And I said, well, I think I missed those questions. I didn't study them. And he's like, well, that was stupid. And from that point on, it was those experiences that, oh, I need to study everything. Like the answer is very simple. I just need to study more. And so if I don't understand it, what's the point of asking my teacher? I just simply needed to study harder. That was the answer. What I learned later on, and this was the benefit of, I actually went to Mira Costa College when I was 16 and took psychology classes. Seeing it taught to me differently was that, and this is what I tell my students, is learning and failure go hand in hand. And sometimes learning and failure is the same thing. You only learn if you fail. That you can't, if you never actually make a mistake, you'll never really learn anything. Like that, what you're doing is just regurgitating. And so part of failure is engaging with your teachers. It's engaging hopefully with your parents if they're understanding enough, teachers and professors if they're understanding and want to engage with you. But I found myself learning a lot better and actually doing a lot better on exams when I was able to kind of engage. My concern is that we're losing that right now because I think, and it's not to any of our faults, it's just that everything's online right now, is that it cuts out that engagement. And so what this is that I think there's a universal quality to this. You don't have to be Asian to know this part of shame or this part of this struggle. But today is just more talking about specifically what our Asian students go through. That's the things that are a little bit more unique. Yes, Aliko, these students in the health center who come in with anxiety attacks because they failed a test or a class and not realizing that they could have asked for help a long time, like earlier. And so sometimes it's encouraging them to just, well, if you failed the class, next time try asking first, see how that works. Encouraging them to experiment with this thing called engagement. So we have 10 more minutes, and I wanted to leave more room for any more questions. I've really appreciated today. I value much more discussion and much more kind of, as you can tell, this kind of engagement. So please feel free if you have any more questions, comments, anything that I missed and maybe I didn't answer.
If anyone does want to share, please feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Okay.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cow. I think this has been really a wonderful training, and I know I learned a lot, and we're getting tons of positive feedback. So I so appreciate your time and taking the time to help lead this training and conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Anytime.
And for all of you on the call today, this was recorded, and you will be getting an email in the next few days with a link to the PowerPoint and the recording. And again, please feel free to email me or wellness@foundationccc.org to find the links for the trainings coming up. But thank you all so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you. And Carly, I'll email that PowerPoint to you right now.
Great, thank you. All right, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.